Good Friday evening, everyone. Welcome back and thank you for joining us once again to meet another spectacular personality on Master Speak today. Today is going to be the 23rd episode of Master Speak, and we're just 2 episodes shy of our Silver Jubilee. We would like to thank our audience, all of you, and our speaker for a fabulous response to this initiative that Future Generali Life Insurance has brought to you. Now let's set you up for a good weekend. Before we do that, let's do a quick check on some housekeeping rules. Now, I hope all of you who are watching this show and your families are safe and healthy. If that's the case, please click the like button, give us a thumbs up so we know everybody who is watching us and your families are absolutely safe. It's absolutely important for us to know. Okay. Now, our guest speaker for today would like to know which city are you joining us from, which town, which part of the country you're joining us from. So please share that with us in the comment section and also tag any of your friends who you want to join us on Master Speak today. Learning is always fun with friends. So make sure that you tag your friends and invite them on Master Speak so that they can be a part of this forum as well. Lastly, don't forget to keep your comments coming in as we progress in the session today. All your questions, keep posting it in the comment section. We're going to be picking your questions and asking of our speaker today. Remember, two lucky questions will be announced as winners at the end of the session. So stay tuned until the end of the session and make sure that your question is the one that gets shortlisted. Now, you can find the recordings of all our previous sessions, all the 22 sessions that we've had on Master Speak. And we've had some absolutely spectacular sessions in the last few months. All of them are available on our social channels, Facebook, LinkedIn, and even YouTube. Make sure that you are browsing through those sessions and having a learnful weekend. Now, coming to today's session, did you ever wonder how some organizations manage to take advantage of the adversity and turn it into opportunity for themselves and give them a sustainable competitive advantage, while some others barely manage to react and find themselves pushed back? Well, today's session is going to tell you how vigilant organizations emerge stronger from the current chaos. I am super happy to introduce a highly distinguished speaker on our show today. Let's give it up for Professor George S. Tay, straight from US of A. It's good morning for George over there. And I would like to express my gratitude and my entire team's gratitude for George to having joined us today early in the morning from USA. Now, George is a professor emeritus at the Wharton School. He was founder and co-director of the Mack Institute of Innovation Management. He is the past chairman of American Marketing Association. He is known to be one of the legends of marketing. Now, George has been a consultant to numerous corporations, and the big ones such as GE, IBM, Metropolitan Life, Unilever, Boeing, LG, Best Buy, Merck, Johnson & Johnson, just to name a few. The list is possibly 45 minutes if I were to read out all the names. He is also on 10 boards of directors for non-profit organizations and for profit organizations. Now, Dr. Day has authored 19 books in his career in the areas of marketing and strategic management. His most recent book is See Sooner, Act Faster: How Vigilant Leaders Thrive in an Era of Digital Turbulence, with Paul Shoemaker, 2019. Now, George, to my delight, is pretty familiar with India, and he's been to our country about 8 to 10 times. And I'm sure he can't wait to come back soon as we get back our lives from this pandemic. Thank you so much for joining us. It's such a pleasure to have you here with us. All of us are eagerly waiting to listen from you.
Thank you, Rakesh. And thanks to the whole team from Future Generali for making this possible. And I was just reflecting that although I've been in India many times, I can't wait to return, that otherwise, had it not been for the pandemic, I might not be talking to you in these circumstances. We're looking at a world that is basically upside down. And yet, as Rakesh indicated, there will be some companies that will come out the other side of the uncertainty, the pandemic, as we hope within a year, and they will emerge stronger. So my interest in talking with you is about having you assess how strong your company is, how vigilant it is, and how well prepared you are to emerge from the difficult times we're facing right now. So if I could have the first slide. And I'm going to talk about how vigilant organizations gain an edge and will become stronger as they emerge. Because, as the title of my latest book with Paul Schumacher suggests, and Rakesh already mentioned, it's about the organizations that see early warning signs and latent opportunities sooner than their rivals, and they understand them, and then they take whatever action is necessary to prepare themselves to act faster when the time is right. And it's really a story, as you'll see, about leadership. And I'll be talking a lot about the nature of vigilant leadership teams, but sharing our research and our findings in a way that I hope you'll be able to apply to your own organizations. And I'm anxious to get your feedback, your questions, but I will be talking for maybe 20, 25 minutes to set the stage, and then we'll, I really am most interested to understand what you're seeing, although I'm watching carefully what's going on in India, and it is troublesome as it is here in the United States. So let me move to the next slide and set the stage a little more precisely. I'm going to start with the really my favorite management scholar, Peter Drucker, who argued that turbulence is what we're dealing with now. It's highly irregular, erratic, but if you understand it and analyze it, you can manage it. So let me get the rest of the slide up, and we'll walk through all the elements. So what we're going to be talking about is what I would characterize as a collective capability of organizations, small, medium, large. It's not a big company issue. It's not a small company issue. It's it's really a function of capabilities and culture. But vigilance is all about curiosity, being open, that's the candor, and investing in foresight. That is looking over the horizon, thinking about the future, and trying to position the organization, whether you be nonprofit or for-profit, to be ready for what's coming next. And so, as I mentioned, the key premise is that vigilant organizations really will have more degrees of freedom, whereas let me turn to the vulnerable organizations that will struggle with this, and they will struggle because they're carrying probably too much debt, have high fixed costs, which is an unfortunate feature of many Indian companies. They also are less agile. We're discovering what's happening to supply chains. Now, supply chains have not been top of mind for most organizations. They are optimized for efficiency, and yet we're discovering now that in the midst of the pandemic, they're extremely fragile, and they're leaving the companies in a highly vulnerable position. vulnerable organizations are the ones that really didn't see early enough the need to outsource to reduce their fixed cost exposure. And more importantly, they did not see the need to invest heavily in digital technologies. And as we'll see, that's a big feature of vigilant organizations. So I'm going to have three topics, if I could bring the third up. I'm going to first start with, okay, what do we know about vigilance? And then I'm going to talk about the three horizons of turbulence during the corona chaos, my term for the extraordinary volatility and uncertainty. It's a chaotic environment. The three horizons are the here and now, just keeping our footing during the extreme uncertainty. Horizon 2 is when we start to pivot into the future, and Horizon 3 is really over the horizon. So we're going to talk about what you do in order to improve vigilance. So let me move to the next slide, please. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples. These are mostly my clients, and I'll start with why vigilance matters so much. And one of my favorite examples is Adobe. Most of you have Photoshop or use Photoshop, but let's go back to the maybe 12, 13 years ago. Adobe Acrobat was sold as packaged software. You remember you went into a software store, you bought your package shrink wrapped, and you loaded it in your computer, it was yours. But about 12 years ago, Adobe leadership really was concerned because they could see the possibilities of computing moving into the cloud. Now, that was well ahead of anybody else that was outside the immediate industry. But they made a decision almost 8 years ago now to switch over, and instead of selling shrink wrap software for, say, $100, now they sold it as a subscription. And indeed, the subscription price was considerably lower than the shrink wrap price. Customers really some customers were really unhappy about shifting from owning their own software to really having to pay a subscription and not having ownership of the software. Enormously successful because they achieved two things. One, they added a lot more functionality, so customers were very happy. Competitors were blocked from getting into their business, because had they waited perhaps until someone else, an Oracle or Microsoft, had seen this same opportunity, they might have had to share the space. Now they totally own the Photoshop and photo editing space, as well as many related categories. Let me give you another example. Sonoma County wine growers, it's the second largest industry wine growing region in the world. And I apologize for my phone. Yeah. Here, let me just.
Call from Emeritus.
The Sonoma County wine growers 8 years ago decided that they were going to become the world's first certified sustainable region. And that was an 8-year commitment. Now, when we look at the success of that, that has given them enormous leverage as the world has moved towards sustainability and emphasizing sustainability. It's a question here again of, because they saw sooner that this was eventually going to emerge as a compelling issue, they took at considerable risk and expense, they moved towards really positioning themselves as the world's leader. Now, let me go to a couple of examples on the vulnerability side, and we can see what happens. So if I could have the next slide, please. So I won't go through too many of these examples, but I will remind you, if you're not familiar with the Boeing 737 MAX, which was a case of ignoring the weak signals of problems until it was too late. A tragic event because of the 2 crashes, but it was unnecessary had the Boeing company been vigilant and listened to both its customers and its internal engineering people. Another egregious example of leadership ignoring weak signals, there was and this went on for several years, a scam whereby employees who were incented to open up new accounts actually opened up fake accounts, and the customer didn't even know about it. And there were millions of these accounts, and it became an enormously embarrassing and traumatic event for Wells Fargo, from which they barely recovered. But they paid well over $3 billion in fines as we're speaking right now. So vulnerable organizations are those that sometimes suffer from willful blindness, but are not open. They're not curious about things that don't make sense, and they suffer dramatically. Danske Bank, which I don't even have on here, had a serious problem when it funneled an enormous amount of Russian money through its Estonia branch. And this was extremely embarrassing when they discovered that, but they should have seen it much sooner had they been open to the weak signals. So let's talk about what we do about this. And I'm going to start with the next slide by summarizing what we've learned about vigilance and vigilant organizations. If I could have the next slide. Oh, there we go. I'm going to start with a quote from Jack Welch, who was the storied leader of GE. And he argues for a sixth sense, an ability to see around the corner or over the horizon. And it turns out this is a discipline. This is a capability that organizations can create. It has to be continuously used. And it's based upon the following lessons, which I'll use when I get to the last part of our time together and talk about an action agenda. Firstly, I think it's important to accept that leadership teams have limited collective attention. That is, there are many, many demands on their time, and they're pulled and pushed with short-term demands, immediate problems, HR issues, and so because it's a scarce resource, Vigilant companies, we find, have the leadership teams that specifically spend time looking into the future. Now, one of the other things that my colleague Paul Schumacher and I found and by the way, we have never found a counterexample. And we've done many deep dives into many different organizations. But I think it's safe to say that when firms are surprised, someone in the organization or your broader network knew all about it. But leadership didn't know they knew, and they didn't know leadership needed to know. So imagine you've got a sales manager in Andhra Pradesh who is concerned about possibly a competitor with a value proposition or a contamination problem. And if that person on the periphery of the organization doesn't know who to talk to, it may not get forwarded, and the firm will then be surprised. I'm going to talk a lot about the third lesson, which is the character of the leadership teams, but one consistent finding is it's all about curiosity and openness to diverse inputs. They also exercise this curiosity by standing outside their organization and looking at it realistically and objectively from the standpoint of their competitors and their customers. Let me talk a little bit about capabilities, because I'm going to be spending more time on that. But the capabilities are guided by really good questions. And I'll talk a lot about investments in foresight. Finally, and happily, our model of Vigilant has been tested. It was recently tested to test the question, do vigilant organizations really outperform their vulnerable rivals? So they used our definition, the team of researchers in Denmark used our definition to study 85 multinational corporations. And what they found was that the increase in market capitalization of the vigilant organizations using our criteria was about 75% increase in market cap over the period 2008-2015, whereas vulnerable organizations were only half as much, at about 38% growth in market cap. So there are incredible economic incentives and survival issues at risk here, at play here. So let's talk about the action agenda. And so I'm going to be anticipating some of your questions. And the issue I'm going to turn to in the next slide is how we have gone about studying this and what the action agenda is. So very briefly, it consists of 4 steps. And the first and foremost is the demonstration of leadership commitment to vigilance. That drives everything. And we've tested this with data now from almost 450 organizations. We've had some of them are, and in fact, we tested it with large foundations that are global. There's nonprofits. We've tested with 118 global companies and a number of specialized companies in the financial services sector. And it stands up. So we think we have a pretty robust model that starts with leadership commitment. Then the leadership demonstrates their commitment through consistent and really effective investments in foresight. Then you change how you go about making strategy, and then you align the organization for vigilance. So let's walk our way through each of these steps, and I'll talk to each one, and then particularly under leadership vigilance, leadership commitment to vigilance, we'll talk about specifically how companies are reacting and responding to and getting ahead of the pandemic. So if I could have the next slide, which again, as I want to emphasize, I am a long-standing student and admirer of Peter Drucker. He's been enormously influential in my thinking. And he observed some years ago that only three things happen naturally in organizations: friction, confusion, and underperformance. Everything else requires leadership. So what would this look like? Let's go to the next slide. What would this leadership commitment look like? And I'm starting off with a fun quote here, which you might look at and say, well, this is a little odd coming at this juncture, but it really, I think, suggests the character of the kind of leadership team that I'm advocating. And it is by Isaac Asimov. He said, basically, the most exciting phrase to hear in science is not "Eureka, I found it," but "That's funny." And if I invite you to go back to many scientific breakthroughs, and they often came from what we'll call anomalies. So by demonstrating leadership commitment, the leadership team, and by the way, this is a team sport. I'm talking about the C-suite in a corporation or the leadership team in a division of a company. But what we've seen and learned is that vigilant companies spend much more time thinking about the future. They really cultivate curiosity, and they share vigilance stories. And let me hook together this notion of dissecting anomalies. So there was a famous story about a CEO that wanted to change a major automotive company, and the character of this company was such that whenever they had a leadership meeting, which they regularly scheduled for 2 hours every Monday morning, there was a series of well-curated, really scrubbed PowerPoint decks. So there were no surprises in that meeting. And after he joined the company, he listened to one meeting with all these PowerPoints, which had been vetted the week before. He said, I don't want any more PowerPoints. Instead, we're going to talk about, we're going to begin every meeting by discussing anomalies. An anomaly is something that's out of order. It's unexpected, and it requires explanation. So an anomaly is something that triggers curiosity. It could be strange behavior by a dealer. Why did the dealer do that? Why did he make that offer? So curiosity turns out to be a big deal in demonstrating leadership commitment. You also want to bring in as much of your knowledge network, and I can speak a lot to this later, but the board of directors in most organizations is an absolutely untapped resource. So let's talk about how to demonstrate leadership commitment during the pandemic. And I'll come back to the notion of the vigilance quotient. So could I have the next slide, please? So here are the three horizons I mentioned at the outset. Starting in late May, I'm thinking particularly how applicable this is to Indian organizations. The share of leadership attention on the y-axis, the vertical, is totally consumed with Horizon 1, the here and now of protecting the organization, keeping the staff healthy, maintaining supply chains if you can. So this is the coping time. And that for most organizations is still the bulk of their attention span. But what we find in vigilant organizations is that they're also preparing to pivot, and Horizon 2 is over the medium term. And then in particular, a characteristic of vigilant organizations, they're already looking out over the horizon and imagining what's going to happen. So in the next slide, I'm going to show you what kinds of discipline is needed to start thinking about Horizon 3, even in the midst of trying to cope with the immediate crisis. And so if I could have the next slide. So there are a number, these are derived from a variety of sources, mostly my clients. But here are some foresight questions that organizations should already be thinking of. And indeed, many are already looking at trends. For example, I'm absolutely fascinated by how each of us has adapted to remote working. And so what trend, this has been accelerated dramatically, brought forward. But the big question is, how will our sector be reshaped? You need to have a point of view on that in order to position yourself, make some initial moves, perhaps market studies, experiments, alliances, small acquisitions. So what you need to do is make sure the Horizon 1 reactions don't get in the way of and constrain your future moves. So what are the biggest uncertainties? Are we looking at a real inflection point? What strategic moves can we make that will ensure we emerge as a leader? And one of the things that I think is crucially important, and those of you that work with McKinsey, you'll see that they've had a series of studies on possible scenarios for the extent of the coronavirus impact, the pandemic's impact, and plausible scenarios for emergence. But I know that in India, your uncertainty is around, will it be a stop go? And when will it be lifted? There is the looming issue of travel restrictions. These are all issues that you want to capture in plausible scenarios. By scenario here, I simply mean alternative possible futures. And scenario thinking is admirably suited towards the deep uncertainty we're facing right now. What moves can we make? This is, I think, an important question for vigilant organizations. Where could we possibly make a small toehold acquisition? Or what I'm hearing a lot is that companies are really investing in talent, that is the vigilant companies, the ones that are going to get stronger, are looking around to their rivals and seeing which of the talent in their rivals or related sectors they would like to hire to enhance their capability when they emerge. And the particular talent that I'm seeing is around innovation. So these are some questions that I think are really important. And I would suggest you pull them together in some kind of issue map, such as in the next slide. So here's the kind of issue maps that we're creating for many different companies. This is a bit of a composite, and I won't spend a lot of time going through it because it takes hours to think through the implications. But this is a composite of two related companies, and they're looking at the issues around ESG, which is environmental, social governance, and they also have a lot of issues around digital transformation, supply chain resilience. So these are all the things they're watching. They're also very concerned about the pushback on globalization, the potential consequence of trade wars, shutting off IP flows, and then marketing practices, because of digital transformations and digital capabilities, will change a lot. Now, those circles capturing possible issues are important of their own, and most companies could put that together. Where you want to spend the time is on the interactions, and that is, for example, let's take the arrow, but the interactions I'm suggesting are from digital transformation to marketing practices. So marketing practices on their own we can see, but you also have to consider the acceleration of these practices by breakthroughs in digital. And imagine where we would be without 5G or and related capabilities that'll enable remote working or workplace automation. So these kinds of maps can help us really get our minds around what are the main issues we have to be watching. Remember, this is Horizon 3. What's coming over the horizon? So let's talk about the next moves to build a vigilance capability. Could I have the next slide, please? When we studied the vigilant organizations and contrasted them with vulnerable ones, we found, just to remind you that leadership commitment to vigilance, demonstrated, as I mentioned earlier, was the most critical driver of whether you're a vigilant or a vulnerable organization. But the way that leadership is exercised is through investments in foresight. So we see, for example, the vigilant organizations investing in a lot of dynamic sensing. They spend a lot of time out on the periphery of their organization. And that's why I love Andy Grove's old observation. When spring comes, snow melts first at the periphery, because that's where it is most exposed. And so I mentioned that earlier. I want to underline it. You have to have really good sensors out in each of the states in India. And I've worked with enough companies that there is such enough Indian companies to respect the fact that there's an enormous diversity among the states, and that having a sensor in each state is enormously valuable. But at the same time, investments in foresight require you to systematically search for opportunities. And for example, again, staying with the states of India, is there a typically in your sector or industry a precursor where things happen first? But also, much can be learned from people who complain, and by systematically encouraging complaints and understanding defectors, that is, people who were once loyal but now are buying from someone else, by investing in understanding and learning about why they left, why they complained, and you could get an enormous amount of insights, leading indicators of problems. You could look at what partners are doing, and I would encourage the creation of a future forward or a foresight team to plan ahead. And I'm sure many of your organizations already have these plan ahead teams who are the focal point in the organization for all the intelligence that and all the planning for emergence. So second big move is investing in foresight. Now the third, and then I'm going to wrap up fairly soon, and I'm just going to tell you a little bit about the third and fourth moves, and then open it up for your questions, and which I'm very much looking forward to. So let's go to the next slide, and how to build a vigilant organization. Firstly, I put up a quote here by Stephen Blank, and he makes a strong assertion, but there are no answers inside the building. You've got to get outside the organization. And by outside in thinking, I mean, stand back and think through how a customer looks at you, and try to be really objective. So this is really a function of really standing, rather than inside out and asking how could we use our resources better. We want to stand back and understand how the competitors and customers' needs are changing, and how we can work with them. In that spirit, red teaming is role-playing competitors' moves. And we find that the concept of guiding questions is really helpful in focusing attention. So I'm just going to, there's a number of questions that we like to pose, but for example, learning from the past, you might want to look at your past blind spots where you saw sooner, saw late, both threats and opportunities. And are there patterns where you were surprised or blindsided? What are the, by interrogating the present, I would suggest you look at what the outliers and mavericks are saying. But anticipating the future is really where the game is played. And one of the companies I've been working with for many years, Medtronic, has allowed me to share this example. But they were very concerned about the possibility that a drug might displace the functionality of their pacemakers and defibrillators. That's the business. That's the core of their business. So what they did was they created a task force and really searched for possible technologies that could have that electrochemical capability, displacing the electrical capability of their pacemakers. And what they found is that there was not a big risk for a drug, but they also learned a lot about drugs that could enhance the performance of their existing products and pacemakers. So let's move finally to the last element of the, and I'll not say too much about this, but be open to questions because I see that time is getting ahead of me. But just in terms of aligning the organization, which is the final step in becoming vigilant, we have to always be mindful of Upton Sinclair's rather snarky comment, "It's difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding it." So this means, and what we find in vigilant organizations is they're prepared to listen to uncomfortable news. And that was the tragedy of Wells Fargo. They totally did not want to hear that customers were being abused and exploited. A second element is in vigilant organizations that information is shared across the boundaries of the audience. So you don't want to have information, weak signals of threats and opportunities bottled up. And then finally, you want small teams. This is a really about, and we started off by talking about agility, and that's a big topic. I'm sure many of your other speakers have already addressed this, but I like the two pizza rule by Jeff Bezos, which is never have a team bigger than can be fed with two pizzas, which is a particularly American concept, but it means about 5 or 6 people. So let me go to the last slide, and then I would really welcome your questions, feedback, comments. So the last slide, which really kind of sums up why vigilance is so important. And I'm going to go all the way back to Charles Darwin, and who observed in his studies, it's not the strongest who survive, nor the most intelligent, but the ones most responsive to change, that is adaptive. So that is our experience in building vigilance or adaptability. And I hope these insights have been helpful to you in assessing your own organization. And now I look forward to getting your question. Rakesh, you're going to curate these for me?
Cool. Okay. Okay, sorry. John, lost my connection for last 2-3 minutes. So are you through with your presentation?
Yes, that's the last slide.
Okay.
And I took longer. I can get really excited about this. So I talked a little longer, but I do have the slides in the questions in the private chat.
Yes. So, George, I am going to put those questions to you. First of all, thank you very much for a very interesting and informative session there. I didn't want it to get over, honestly. Thought we could go on a little longer. I was totally enjoying it. And I'm sure everybody who's watching us would agree with me. So thank you very much for such an interesting session today. So, and there were very powerful messages there for leaders who are watching us, suggesting framework to how to make the organization a vigilant organization and in turn create more value than the vulnerable ones. So George, before I pick up the questions from the audience, I see a bunch of them. Just tell us a bit about your work in India and which organization, from your experience, would you consider to be vigilant organization in India so far that you have seen?
I haven't been there for 2 years, which is to me very disappointing, and I look forward to getting back. But I have found a number of organizations to be, and the difference between vigilant and vulnerable is pretty wide in India. So my concern is much more about the vulnerable organizations in India that are suffering with high fixed costs and maybe high debt loads that constrain their ability. And I think the organizations that have demonstrated foresight have perhaps done outsourcing or invested in digital technologies to reduce their fixed cost ratios. Because I think a lot of Indian companies have perhaps fixed costs that are too high, and that reduces your adaptability and flexibility greatly.
Thanks for that, George. Going to now go to the audience question, and this one is an interesting one from Jamshed Dabu. Jamshed is commenting that there is a clear shuffle at the top end of the pecking order. When it comes to companies, and you see tech-led companies like Amazon, Microsoft, Netflix, Google, Facebook, and even Tesla. And I think the question is for Tesla. These are the companies which are topping the charts. So Jamshed wants to know that he wants to know your views. That Tesla sells about 350,000 cars a year against 8 million GM, and Tesla is $90 billion in valuation versus GM's 50 billion. So how do you see these two companies through the model of vigilant organizations, and explain the difference in the valuation that these companies command today?
So this really brings up a much bigger problem, and that is the distinction between Main Street realities, which are pretty dire in both India and especially in the United States. By Main Street realities, I mean high unemployment, a struggling economy, a slow recovery, but by the end of this year will be probably GDP will be down 6%. And yet Wall Street, the equity markets, are doing extremely well. And the reason is it's about futurity of global corporations. So there's a big disconnect in what's happening on the ground and in the valuations of the companies. And I don't have a lot of confidence in the difference in valuations between GM and Tesla, because I do think that GM is not getting nearly enough credit for its really outstanding work on mobility, on autonomous cars, and I think the drag on GM is perhaps their legacy businesses, but that does give them a big base of resources, and so I don't expect that we're going to see this ratio of valuations to continue. To me, it's an unstable situation, because Tesla has been an enormously effective company at seeing sooner. They saw the possibility and jumped on it much earlier, and they, for example, didn't have the legacy costs of dealerships. So the car being purchased online, that has helped them enormously. But I think that Tesla has momentum, and there's the famous saying in or acronym FOMO, fear of missing out, and so there's a lot of day traders jumping into Tesla, riding the momentum up. But I think over 3 to 4 years, the valuations will probably return to about possibly equivalent. But the secret is in the old joke: if you're going to forecast often, and if you ever get it right, keep reminding people. So the trick here is to keep watching and understand that Elon Musk is an enormously visionary leader. But thanks, that's a great question.
Yes, thanks, Jamshed, for that questions. Shout out to our audience. Please keep your questions coming in. We've got some time to ask questions to Professor George Day today. So, George, the next question again is an interesting one from Sarat Chand. And you mentioned about this in one of your slides. We also know what's the difference between being paranoid and being vigilant in the context of responding to current chaos.
Mm-hmm. Not much. And I'm going to go back to probably the most influential leader of a Vigilant company, and that was Andy Grove. 20 years ago, really shifted Intel dramatically, because they could look over the horizon and see that their business model was not going to succeed in the long term. So based on that experience, about, I think, 12 years ago now, he wrote a book, Only the Paranoid Survive. And his definition of paranoia looks a lot like our definition of vigilance. That is acute sensitivity to changes, anomalies, weak signals. And so he really set the stage for a lot of the work that we've done subsequently. So I guess my answer would be there are a lot of similarities. And I'll remind you again of the title. It's Healthy to be Paranoid.
Okay, the next one is Nanda Panika. I think she wants to know, how do you, again, you mentioned about it in one of your slides, how do you really know when to pivot? I think when you spoke of horizons, George, given that most organizations have a commitment to 3 to 5 year plans, and the choice of strategy is also to remain consistent.
Yep.
So how do you know when to pivot? And I think I'll just take this question along with another question from Manish Pathak, where Manish wants to know, how do you really differentiate between short to medium term turbulence versus a long term disruption? I think possibly you can take these two questions together, George.
Wow, that's a big package of questions, but they all get at the core of the matter. That is, how much time should you be spending in your organization now on the immediate crisis, which is most of the time, and how much should you be spending looking at Horizon 2 and Horizon 3? And by Horizon 2, I mean, how much time should you be spending pivoting and getting ready for whatever the new normal is? So let me benchmark this against what we find in more normal circumstance. Then I'll bring it up to date in terms of how we're coping with the pandemic. But under normal circumstances, vigilant organizations spend about half their time looking over the horizon into the future. That is, they're thinking about emerging technologies, trends, events, and how they can position their organization. Remember, seeing sooner is all about getting the weak signals that are available to everyone and interpreting them more accurately and then testing them. But by acting faster doesn't mean that you make big irreversible commitments. What we mean by act faster is that you essentially buy a lot of real options. You've done the experiments. You may have bought a window into a new technology. So real options can be exercised when the time is right. And that's the whole idea between being prepared or versus being surprised. That is the ability to act when the time is right. And I'd say that is exactly the case we've got right now. I can't imagine that any company can be confident that they know when the lockup is going to end, or I guess it's ending in India, but I'd be very concerned about a start-stop. But that issue is very much Horizon 1 issue. But I would urge most of you listening to spend some time thinking about the trends that are being brought forward very rapidly and how that's going to impact your organization. And that's why vigilant organizations are going to come out ahead when things really revert to some kind of a new normal. So that's the basic idea. And the question was, well, how do you know when? And there is so much uncertainty around that you have to be monitoring very carefully. And when your organization shares information, you got all the weak signals and say, okay, now it looks as though things are opening up. But it's all about preparedness, getting ready for what's coming next. So I guess my answer would be that right now we don't know, but the vigilant organizations will be one monitoring much more carefully and making moves to prepare themselves to take advantage of the new normal when it emerges.
Thank you so much, George. I just want to take a check with you on your time. Are we good for a couple of more questions?
I'm very happy to take more questions. These are
Excellent.
insightful and helpful. And
Thank you so much, George.
I hope my answers are useful, but I do want to remind everyone that we're dealing with an enormous amount of uncertainty, perhaps unprecedented, and that's why you have to be both alert and prepared. So yeah, let's hear some more questions.
Great. Thank you so much, George, for that. Okay, the next one is from Hemlata, and she wants to know that you spoke of vigilance quotient in one of your slides. So how do you really define that or assess vigilance quotient in an organization?
Yeah, that was a good catch. I didn't have time during my brief overview of what we've learned, but this would be a little bit of a plug for our new book. The vigilance quotient can be assessed from a survey that we've used in many, many organizations over the past 5 years. And it captures 5 sets of questions, which, by the way, are available in the back of the book. And I'd be happy to send you a copy of the survey if you're interested. But basically, the vigilance quotient is your performance based upon how good you are compared to your rivals on seeing opportunities, dealing with threats, and that sort of thing relative to your competition. So, for example, is there someone in your industry always seems to have a deeper insight to be ready when the time is right? And then we have 5 or so questions on each of the 4 drivers of your vigilance performance. Leadership commitment, so investments in foresight. So you can audit your performance and compare, and we show in the book what best practices are. And so VQ, vigilance quotient, is all of the elements that I've talked about.
Thank you, George. This is from Sumit. And Sumit's question is essentially for smaller organizations who possibly don't have access to large pool of capital, or who are possibly not really ahead of the tech curve, but they're growing and they have the appetite to grow. So what will they be doing? Given that this pandemic, of course, at the end of the day, there will be a case of winner takes it all because they have the muscle power. But how would you advise smaller organizations to remain vigilant, focused? What can they do differently?
Well, firstly, this is not a big or small company question. We find vigilant organizations can be very small or very large, as can vulnerable organizations. So for a small organization, it's really a matter of 2 things: exercising curiosity, that is by the principals, the leader, the leadership team, and it's reaching out and connecting in perhaps networking outside of the normal comfort zone. And so we find that the concept of vigilance is not a function of size. It's a function of the leadership team, curiosity, candor, and that is, by candor, I mean, are they willing to face up to the message from that might be uncomfortable, and are they reaching out beyond the normal confines of their industry? So I think the experience I've had is that a small organization can actually move much faster and capture an opportunity that's emerging, perhaps, that a bigger company might see but can't move as quickly to capture.
Thanks, George. Okay, the next one, I have two more questions. I guess this is the second last one.
Good.
It's an interesting one. George Mihir wants to know, as a result of this current pandemic, to your mind, which product or service do you see vanishing as a result of this pandemic?
Oh boy, vanishing. I'd have to get my mind around that one. I don't see any obvious candidates for completely being obliterated. I'd say there will be major structural shifts. For example, I'm absolutely fascinated by the shift to online working. Now, I think that as I'm reading the data, talking to senior leaders about what they're seeing, is that they don't expect it to stay at the same level. But the shift to online working would be, and surely will be, troubling to commercial real estate. It's very conceivable that the big commitment to large open spaces in skyscrapers in Mumbai or New Delhi will be a thing of the past, and we'll do much more remote working. There will be many more people who will come in periodically into the office rather than every day, which will have enormous ramifications. I don't think we've really understood what the long-term consequences will be. And that's why we do scenario planning, because there's huge uncertainty around that. But I'd say if I had one industry in mind that's going to be impacted adversely, it would surely be commercial real estate. But obviously, the tourism, travel, airline sector is going to be struggling for a while. But the underlying desire of people to travel, to explore, and learn is going to continue to be there. So these will have to adjust dramatically, and they'll have to watch and be ready to move quickly. Remember, vigilant organizations tend to be more agile. They're structured with a team-based organization, and they don't have the high level of fixed costs which constrain them. So I think already I'm seeing more companies doing outsourcing and using digital technologies to keep their fixed costs down. And those would be prudent at any point.
George, I can't help but ask, it's a marketing question. It's not really to do with vigilant organization. But how do you see marketing changing, post-COVID? It was already changing thanks to data technology, automation, all that sort of stuff. But how do you see that now changing from here?
Well, in terms of marketing practice, the remote working will have a dramatic effect, but I'd say it'll take a lot of efficiency out of the system. So marketing is this big, expansive function, but where I see the biggest and most dramatic changes in marketing would surely be the impact of digital technologies accelerated in terms of changing the customer experience. And then, of course, we are always going to be concerned about and thoughtful about what happens to retailers that are mostly bricks and mortar who really have to shift online. So again, that's one of those moves that has brought forward trends that were already apparent, but it's been accelerated. But I'd say in terms of marketing practice, each company is going to find a different path, but it has to be prepared for different scenarios. And then monitoring closely what competitors are doing, peers, precursors. I spend a lot of time looking at precursors. And by that, I mean companies or markets that behave in advance of the market I'm serving. I mentioned some of the Indian companies I've worked with have divided the states of India into a few precursors, which they can reliably track trends and then expect to see them emerging in other states later. And that's part of being vigilant.
Great. Thank you so much, George. That just brings me to the last question for the today. There are a lot of young people who are watching. India is a young country, as you know, and I'm sure a lot of our audience is, budding professionals wanting to make it big, in the area of business or in the area of marketing. So, what would be your advice to our audience before we end the session today?
Well, marketing careers are fascinating, important, and so I have to back up a little bit to answer that. I consider marketing as first and foremost a general management function, not a general management responsibility that is as the external face of the organization. Then it's also a functional activity, but marketing as a function and as a general management responsibility will surely be dramatically changed by technology. So young people have a huge advantage in this regard, but they're digital natives. They're comfortable with the technology, and I'd say for a young person, this is an incredible time to enter into marketing and to build your skill base around deep data analytics, artificial intelligence, because that's where the future is going to be. And I am excited for you because there is so much potential here. And I see this especially in India with the incredible depth of technology and technology capability and talent. I see a very, very bright future for the country and for those that go into marketing. And thank you again for inviting me to share my thinking. And I really wish you all the very best in the future as you emerge from the pandemic. Stay well and stay safe.
Thank you so much, George, for joining us today. It's an honor and a privilege to have you on Master Speak. I thoroughly enjoyed the session. Like I said, I wish we could continue for longer, but I'm sure our audience out there wanted more time with you. But I guess all good things come to an end. So thank you very much, George, for coming today and enlightening us. It was absolutely a pleasure to have this conversation with you.
Thank you very, very much.
Okay. So that's the end of today's segment, today's episode. I hope you guys were making some notes because you were listening to the legend of marketing and you don't get too many of those opportunities. It's thanks to this pandemic times there is always an opportunity in distress situation, and we are making the most of it. We're trying to bring you the best of the best across the world, and share their thoughts, share their perspective, share their learnings with all of us, so that we can find this pandemic together and emerge stronger. So time for me to pick up two lucky questions for today. So the two lucky questions, I think the first one, Jamshed, who asked the question on Tesla. I think that was a good question. So congratulations, Jamshed, for that question. And yes, Sarat, for asking the question around difference between being paranoid and being vigilant. I think that was a very relevant question. Thank you very much for joining us today. Don't forget to come back on 8th of July, 6:30 p.m. We have Mr. Vivek Puthukod, who's the Chief Partner Officer, Microsoft APAC region, in conversation with Subramaniam Gopalaratnam, we call him Money, who is the Chief Technology Officer at Resultix, who also happen to be our community support partner. With that, I would like to thank all our community support partners, Resultix, AdGully, Paul Writer, and Netcore, for helping us spread the message. Thank you guys for being with us, and thank you all of you for joining us. Stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll see you on 8th of July.